Most collectors think they know how to evaluate a watch. They look at the brand, they look at the price, maybe they look at the movement, and then they decide whether it's a good watch or not. But the problem is that some of the best watches that I have ever handled would actually score poorly if you only looked at specifications. And some of the most technically impressive watches that I've seen on paper are watches that I would never personally buy. So today, I'm going to walk you through my complete 8-step framework for evaluating any watch in about 5 minutes. And step 8 is the category that has probably saved me more money than anything else in watch collecting. And most collectors don't even think about it until they've been in the hobby for years. So we'll get into that later in the episode. Now, my name is James, and today's topic is one that I really wish somebody had explained to me much earlier in my collecting journey. Because when I first started collecting watches, I thought evaluating a watch meant just comparing specifications on paper. If it had a bigger power reserve, it was better. If it had more water resistance, it was better. More complications, better. More expensive also usually meant better, which is clearly not always the case. And over time, I learned that collecting is a lot more nuanced than that. So the framework we are going to discuss today will work for you whether you're looking at a $500 Seiko model, a $5,000 Grand Seiko model, a Rolex or Omega, or even a high-horology piece from Jaeger-LeCoultre or Patek Philippe. And by the end of this episode, you will have a simple 8-step checklist that you can use the next time you're evaluating either your current collection or a future watch purchase. Now, as we get started, I always have to do my wrist check for the week. So today I am wearing my Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel. It is an absolutely beautiful and stunning dial of 2 different styles of guilloche with a translucent blue enamel over the top. It's a limited edition from 2019. It is one of my favorite pieces, and it has really become my daily in the collection because I just can't stop staring at the dial still after about 3 years of owning this piece. So the first thing I evaluate is also the most important thing, and that is, do I actually enjoy looking at the watch? Now, that sounds incredibly obvious, probably, but collectors routinely ignore this question. So what often happens is that we become convinced by specifications for the watch. We hear about a specific movement, or maybe it's part of the brand's history. Maybe we hear about that limited edition, right? We hear about it's going to have resale value in the future. And eventually what we do is we start to slowly talk ourselves into liking a watch that never really connected with us visually in the first place. And that's where I think the first mistake comes in that collectors make. The first thing that attracts us all to watches is almost always the visual aspect. Take the Rolex Sky Dweller, for instance. The reason that watch initially caught my attention so many years ago was not because it had an annual calendar, and it wasn't because it had a GMT function. Heck, it wasn't even because of the ring command bezel that I always talk about and love so much. It was the blue dial. It was because of the blue dial. That is what got me, and that's what hooked me on the watch. The movement, the functionality, those things kind of came later as I grew with the watch, as I learned more about the watch. But that emotional connection happened right away. It happened immediately. The same thing happens with something like a Grand Seiko Snowflake, right? Most people don't initially fall in love with that watch because of spring drive, right? Grand Seiko spring drive. Instead, they fall in love with it because of the dial, the texture that's on the dial, the way the light moves across the surface of the dial. It's that feeling that it creates when you see it. I know for me, the same thing happened with my Girard-Perregaux 1966 Orion. The aventurine dial was the first thing that I noticed about it. And long before I cared about the lovely perlage on the movement, or the caliber, or the case dimensions. I was staring at that dial. So when you're evaluating a watch, I always start with aesthetics. And here are some questions that you may want to consider when you're talking about aesthetics. The first one, I already talked about. It's just, do I enjoy looking at it? Am I mesmerized by looking at the dial? That goes a long way. So does the dial interest me? Do the proportions work for me? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Does the color speak to me? Do I like this color? Sometimes we just have themes of color in our collection. Would I still be interested if I didn't know the brand name on the dial? Now that is a really powerful question. So think about your favorite watch for a second in your collection or something that you haven't yet acquired, and then remove the logo from the dial. And the question is, would you still want that watch? Now, sometimes the answer is yes. You have other ties to it that are stronger than just brand, but sometimes the answer is surprisingly no. And that is a useful piece of information to have, because at the end of the day, look, you're going to spend years looking down at this thing on your wrist, hopefully. You're going to have your collection for 10 years, like I talked about in my last podcast. And if you don't enjoy just looking at it, and there's not a sense of genuine appreciation for the watch, for the dial, no specification on a sheet or on a website is going to be able to save it. Now, step 2, once the aesthetics pass the test, then we move on to this category. What is this watch actually trying to be? I think many collectors make the mistake of evaluating every watch using the exact same criteria. Now, this might make sense kind of theoretically, but watches have different purposes. We know this. This is very easy to see. A dress watch should not be judged the same way as you would judge a dive watch. A travel watch wouldn't be judged the same way as a formal watch, right? A collector piece, like some sort of a piece unique or a limited edition, a really special version of a watch, would not be judged the same way as you would judge like a daily wear, kind of a go anywhere, do anything type of watch. Take, for instance, something like the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Moon. It's one of my favorite dressier watches. I would call it a daily potentially, but a dressier watch. Now, what is that watch trying to be? Well, for one, it's trying to be elegant. It's trying to be refined. It's trying to disappear under your cuff and provide beautiful proportions. It really does. It's just so understated, so you don't even really notice it right away. So if somebody would come along and criticize it because, let's say, well, it only has 50 meters of water resistance, they've kind of missed the point of what that watch is all about. That's not its purpose. Now, instead, compare that to an Omega Seamaster 1200 meter Ploprof. The Ploprof is one of the most purpose-built watches ever created. I mean, everything about that watch just screams functionality. It's got a huge case. It's got a bezel lock on it. There's an immense amount of water resistance. The engineering of how it all comes together. It's trying to be a professional dive tool at the end of the day. The Summer Blue version even has a monoblock case to help prevent water from entering the case. It's just an incredible construction. Those two watches could not be more different. And that's totally fine. A watch doesn't need to do everything for you, but it just needs to succeed at the job that it was designed to do. So when evaluating a watch, I ask some of these questions. What category is this? Now you have to be careful because you don't want to build a watch from the checklist, right? We've talked about that before. It's not about building a checklist and having one of every complication in the collection. But what role is it trying to fill? What problem is it solving for you and then within the collection, which we'll get more into. And then I evaluate it against those goals, and not against the checklist. Because every collector who expects every watch to be everything usually ends up really disappointed in their collection. Now, step 3, we're going to move into what I consider to be the first very practical category here. And we're going to talk about wearability. And I do think this is where many purchasing mistakes happen. So collectors will go online, they love the photos, they love the specifications, and they put it on their wrist, and they immediately realize that something is off, right? The watch feels too large or too small. Maybe it's too thick and heavy or too awkward. And I do challenge the conventional notions of fit quite a bit because I do think that people spend too much time focused on fit. Comfort, yes, absolutely important. But the problem that I have with that is that certain watches are only made in certain sizes. I use the Sky Dweller as an example all the time. That was a pretty large watch at a 42 millimeter case, but they only make it in that size. So I can't get a smaller version of that watch. So I do think that there are examples and instances where you may want a watch that in a conventional notion of fit doesn't fit you, but you can still wear it. It still looks good on the wrist. You still like it, and it's doing what you want it to be able to do. So I wanted to make that distinction right away. So when we're talking about wearability, the first measurement I look at is usually not the case diameter. It's actually the lug to lug measurement. So for me, lug to lug often tells me more about wearability than the diameter of a watch. So a watch can be 40 millimeters, for instance, and it can wear beautifully on your wrist. And then you can have another 40 millimeter case, and it may wear just so awfully and uncomfortably. And it really depends on the shape. It depends on the lugs. It depends on how much watch sits on the wrist. So take, for instance, the Rolex Explorer 36 millimeter. Now that watch works for an incredible range of wrist sizes, and the dimensions are incredibly balanced. So then if you take that and you compare it to something like, let's say, a Rolex Deep Sea, amazing watch, just technically impressive. I love the James Cameron edition, by the way. I love the gradient dial of blue to black, but unquestionably, it's a large watch, and not everyone is going to enjoy wearing that watch. Then there's the Omega Ploprof. Let's go back to that for a second, because on paper, the Ploprof sounds absolutely absurd. The dimensions are enormous on that thing. And they've made several iterations of it, right? They've had steel versions, they've had titanium versions. The summer blue version probably is the most wearable. Yet when you put it on the wrist, it wears far better than most people expect. And why is that? Because the dimensions alone don't tell the entire story, right? The shape matters, the weight distribution matters, the bracelet matters, and the way that it actually hugs your wrist when it's on there also matters. So when evaluating a watch in terms of wearability here, I would ask these questions. The first one is really important. It's, would I actually enjoy wearing this watch for 8 hours straight? Because you can have a watch that's beautiful in photographs, and it can still be a terrible fit for your lifestyle, and it can be super uncomfortable when you've worn it after a long day. So that's a really key question is, could I wear this watch all day long? Because if the answer is no, it may not be what you're looking for. Now, once a watch passes the wearability test, then we go on to step 4. I start looking at the materials. I think this is where collectors usually begin diving into specifications, but I try to focus on the practical ownership implications of what that material is. So, for example, what's the case made from? Is it steel? Is it titanium that's a little bit lighter? Is it gold or ceramic, platinum maybe? You know, each one creates a different experience. My Omega Aquaterra Good Planet is titanium. And one of the first things people notice when they pick it up is how light it feels. It changes the entire ownership experience. And I've mentioned before, but I have owned several Aquaterra models over the course of my collecting journey. I've actually had, this is my 4th Aquaterra now, and they've all been different case materials. And that has impacted the wearing experience that I've had. Now, if you compare that to something like my Jaeger-LeCoultre, which is white gold, that watch has some real presence to it. You know, there's density and substance. It just feels different. Now, neither one of those is objectively better, but they're different experiences. And the same thing applies to bracelets, to the clasps, to the crystal quality, you know, finishing, case construction. All of these details matter because they're things you'll interact with every day. And I pay attention to the finishing quality too, right? How well are transitions around the case executed? How clean are polished surfaces? How crisp are the edges? And how thoughtfully has the case actually been designed? Is it flat across the wrist, or does it have a little bit of a camber to it, right? Where it tapers a bit down the sides of your wrist. That can make a big difference in the wearing experience. So sometimes these details will actually tell you more about a watch than a movement specification ever could, because they're the ones that are visible to you every single day on your wrist, and that's what really matters. Now, step 5 is the movement. And I think this is the category that many enthusiasts tend to start with. Now, while I appreciate movements, I don't start here, because to me, movement quality only matters after the watch has already passed several other tests first. So the question that I ask is not, is this the best movement? The question is this the right movement for this watch? So take a Rolex caliber, for instance. I think one of the reasons Rolex movements are so respected is they are incredibly reliable. They're easy to live with, they're accurate, they're robust. They just kind of disappear into the background. Like, you put a Rolex on your wrist and you forget about the fact that you have a watch that can be damaged or dinged or dented or hurt, because you just don't have to worry about that too much with Rolex. Now, if you compare that to something like Spring Drive, say from Grand Seiko, Spring Drive creates an entirely different ownership experience. When you look at the wrist with the Grand Seiko Spring Drive movement, you don't see the tick-tock that you would get on your normal watch. Instead, you just see that really smooth glide motion when you look at the watch. Because instead of an oscillating balance in the movement, you have a governing wheel. It's just moving in the one direction the whole time. You interact with power reserve indicators. They're kind of known for having those on the front. They've started to move them to the back, which I appreciate. You start to kind of see that there's a different engineering philosophy on these watches. Then you have manual wind watches. That creates another completely different experience, right? There's a lot of collectors that they actually enjoy winding their watch every morning. It's become kind of a ritual to them. It's a connection point. You get that moment of interaction with them every single day. Now, others hate that. And I understand this, because I'm very much a practical, like, let's get up and take it and go kind of guy. I don't necessarily need to have time in the morning to wind my watch, and I'm still going to appreciate it just the same. So I like using a winder, but again, I have some complications. I like that. Neither perspective is wrong here. So again, I evaluate movement architecture through the lens of ownership. Use questions like, how will I use this? Like, how is it going to actually work? Will I rotate it often? Do I value the convenience versus do I value the interaction of winding the movement every day? And does the movement support the purpose of the watch? Because that's really important, because a technically impressive movement doesn't automatically create a better ownership experience for you. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood specifications in watch collecting for step 6, and that is water resistance. Collectors just love comparing water resistance numbers, right? And it's easy to do because you have them with every watch, and there's 30 meters, and there's 50 meters, and 100, and 300, and you go all the way up to 1,000 or 1,200 meters, right? Now, the problem is that most people never actually use any of that capability. I think the reality is that for the average collector, 100 meters of water resistance is enough for most owners. You can swim with it, you can travel with it, you can wear it daily, and you will likely never encounter the issue of getting water inside your watch, as long as you make sure you keep the crown screwed down or pushed down, which you always should. So instead of asking something like, how much water resistance does this watch have? I would challenge you to ask, how much water resistance do I need? Because that's a very different question. Sometimes we reject otherwise excellent watches due to specifications on paper that we may never actually use or have to worry about. The context really matters here. I use the Ploprof as an example a lot because it is a really beastie watch. And if you look at the different iterations of Ploprof, like I mentioned, they started out a little bit bigger at something like 48 millimeters lug to lug. The across the wrist dimension was always massive. You're talking about 55 millimeters across the wrist, which is pretty huge. And then the thickness has varied a little bit. Again, it started somewhere in the ballpark of 17 to 18 millimeters thick, but over time, they lightened it a bit with the titanium version. And then again, with the summer blue version they released in 2023, they knocked down those dimensions a lot. They actually reduced the case to 45 millimeters lug to lug, and that 55 millimeter across the wrist still stayed the same, but it went down to under 16 millimeters thick. So on paper, there were a lot of dimensions that actually led me to disqualify that watch from ever wanting to own it or being interested in owning it, because I just thought it was too big, right? But then as I looked into, again, the different iterations of watch that they've made with that and the case dimensions and how they've changed, how they made it a monoblock case, that all impacted the wearing experience. Like taking the date off of that watch made a big difference in thickness because they were able to use the 8912 caliber now, which is basically a no date version of their current movement. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to write off a watch because of some dimension on paper that you think doesn't work for you. Definitely take the time to explore the wearability and some of these other things that we're talking about. So again, the purpose of the watch matters. A dress watch does not need to have the capability of a dive watch. A dive watch doesn't need to wear like an ultra thin dress watch. Everything comes back to its intended use and how it's going to fit in to your collection. Now, step 7. Next, I evaluate complications. Now, this category is fascinating because collectors often go through phases in their watch collecting journey. When many people enter the hobby, they become fascinated with specific types of complications. So maybe they love chronographs, or maybe they love GMTs because they travel all the time. Or maybe it's an annual calendar. It just seems very practical for them. Or they like the mechanical engineering in the theater of a perpetual calendar on the dial. Or maybe even it's a moon phase or a world time mechanism. And I do understand this, right? Because these things are incredible. Like the level of engineering that it takes to make something like the Patek Philippe 5230P with the Louis Coutier world time mechanism is just unbelievable, where you can just press a button, advance it, and the entire dial moves on the wrist. But eventually, many collectors start asking a different question. And that is, will I actually use this complication? So that's where things become interesting. So I'm going to come back to the Sky Dweller again for a second. I genuinely loved using the GMT function on the Sky Dweller, right? It was interesting. You got to turn the bezel, and then you would access the local hour hand function of the watch, and you could just turn it. And it was just really easy to use because it was so easy to be on a flight, getting ready for a flight, and then you can turn the bezel, use the local hour hand, move it an hour forward or 2 hours back or wherever you were traveling. It just made it really convenient. I genuinely appreciated the annual calendar. Like Rolex's Saros annual calendar system in the Sky Dweller is one of the neatest ways to display a calendar. So instead of having it listed out somewhere on the dial, there were just apertures outside of every one of the hour markers. And so you had 12 hours on the dial, and you had 12 apertures. So it was easy to say the 12th one is December, the first one is January, the second one is February. It just came together really easily, and that was a neat way to display that on the dial. Now, those complications made a lot of sense for me, but compare that to a moon phase, right? A moon phase is probably not super useful in daily life. I don't know any collectors that the first thing they do in the morning is they get up and they go to their watch box to pick up their moon phase watch and see what moon cycle is happening today, right? That may not be the way that a lot of people approach it, but it may still create tremendous enjoyment. And that is perfectly valid because utility is not the only reason these complications exist. Again, let's be honest. We're talking about watches that cost thousands of dollars when we could see everything that we need to know right on our phone super easily. So complications may be related to utility, but it's not the only way to look at it. And I think about something like, again, a perpetual calendar or a tourbillon, especially. No one needs to have that information at a glance on the wrist. No one needs to be able to see the balance oscillating on their wrist. You just don't need to be able to see that. But that tourbillon, though expensive, may still bring you a lot of joy when you look at it. And that is something that's a little harder to measure. So don't just get caught up in the utility aspect of this. Some of it is just how much joy does it actually add to your wearing experience. So don't forget that. So sometimes the beauty, the fascination, those things are enough. And the key question is whether that complication adds value to your ownership experience, not whether it sounds impressive on a spec sheet, for instance. Now, step 8, we arrive at the final step. I talked about this at the beginning, that this is the category that has probably saved me more money than brand prestige, than movement quality or specifications ever have. And that one thing is collection fit. Collection fit. This is the category that most collectors overlook. So imagine for a second, 2 scenarios here. In the first scenario, you are considering your 5th blue sports watch. It's a great watch. Let's say maybe it's a Breguet Marine, for instance. Beautiful dial, strong movement, excellent specifications. Now, in the second scenario, you're considering a dress watch that would add something completely different to your collection. And the question is, which one creates more value? Well, the answer is going to depend entirely on your collection. This is why I will always ask, what role will this watch play? What gap does it fill for you? Will I actually choose it over the watches that I already own? Because a watch can be objectively fantastic as a timepiece and still be a terrible purchase decision. And if it constantly loses wrist time to something that you already own, that's important information. I mentioned my Aquaterras before, and one of the biggest challenges that I had with the Aquaterra was it was just too similar to my Sky Dweller. So again, I've had 3 prior versions of Aquaterras. I've had a day-date model of the Aquaterra in blue. It was a little bit bigger case, but again, I was not bothered by that. I really liked it. It's kind of a little more off the beaten path. You don't see those often, and I just thought it was gorgeous, and I love the Aquaterra models, right? So I've had that one. Prior to that, I actually had a 38.5 millimeter steel white dial Aquaterra with the gray accents and strap, and I kind of just needed something as a gym watch almost. And then a little bit later, I had the more modern 41, just simple date version of the Aquaterra. And what I had an issue with was every time I was wearing one of those watches, I always went back to, I would rather be wearing my Sky Dweller here. Like, it just makes more sense for me. I enjoy it more. I like the complication, the look more. And it was always a bit of a tug of war between the Aquaterra and the Sky Dweller. And it didn't really have a super useful place in my collection, those Aquaterras, because I was only really thinking about wearing them if I was worried about dinging the watch, scratching it, denting it, like doing something really, really rough, or being in an area where I just didn't feel comfortable wearing a Rolex. Now, again, that might make sense. However, if you only find that you're in that spot once every year or 6 months, it kind of starts to lose its importance. And it doesn't really make sense to have it sitting there in the collection when you're only going to really need it once every few months. To me, that just didn't make sense. I had another Omega that was actually a Seamaster, but it was not your typical Seamaster. It was the London Boutique Edition. If you've never seen these, it was very cool. They did a series of 4 different models that were limited editions, and they had a version for different cities around the world. So the London edition had this really lovely blue fume fade on the dial. Just spectacular. Not something you would expect a Seamaster from Omega to look like. Now, at that time, I also had already gotten my JLC Master Ultra Thin that I talked about earlier that I'm wearing. And they were so similar. And they had such similar use cases for me that every time I would be wearing that Omega, I would start to feel almost bad that I wasn't wearing my JLC. Even though I loved the Omega, like in its own, it was a great watch. And like I say, not a typical Omega that you would find, but because it was so similar to the JLC, I loved it so much. I always felt like I was leaving it behind and I wanted to be with the JLC more. So I ended up getting rid of the Omega. So that's really important. You've got to think about how those things factor into your collection. And if you have something that's battling for wrist time, that's going to create a little bit of conflict, I think, in how you look at your collection. So when I started to think of my watches as parts of a collection rather than individual purchases, my buying decisions improved dramatically. And I think in many ways, this is where collectors start to become what I call a satisfied collector, because they're no longer just evaluating a watch in isolation. They're evaluating how the watch fits into their collection and into their broader watch journey. And I think that's really important. So now let's bring everything together that we've talked about. When I evaluate a watch in 5 minutes, these are the 8 steps that I am following. These are the 8 questions that I'm asking. The first is, do I genuinely enjoy looking at it? That's step 1. Step 2, what is the watch trying to be? What's it trying to be? What role does it fill? Step 3, will it wear comfortably? Not just case size, not just heft. It's all of those factors. How does it wear on the wrist? Step 4, do the materials and construction support the ownership that I want? Do I want a delicate white gold watch if I'm going to be wearing it in a construction setting? Probably not. So you got to ask that question. Step 5, does the movement fit how I will actually use the watch? Step 6, are the water resistance and capabilities appropriate for the purpose that it's going to serve for me? Again, it's not just about more is better. It's really about how much do I need. Step 7, do the complications add value? Not just are they functional or add utility for me, but do they add value to the ownership experience? And then step 8, again, I think the most important category is, does this watch improve my collection? Am I looking at this as an isolated watch, or am I looking at this as how does it fit into my broader collection? Now, if you can answer those 8 questions honestly, you will understand far more about a watch than someone who just compares spec sheets online. Because the goal is not to objectively find the best watch out there. It's always possible to do that on paper. But the goal is finding the watch that you will still be excited to wear 5 years from now, 10 years from now, decades from now. And to me, that's what being a satisfied watch collector is really all about. So I want to thank you for stopping by and spending some time with me today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Take a look at my episode from last week where I talked about how to build a watch collection that you'll still love in 10 years. It's very relevant to this topic. And when you evaluate a watch, what's the first thing that you look at? I'd be curious to know. I shared some of mine. Share some of yours. Leave them in the comments below. So thanks so much for stopping by, and I will talk to you all next time. Bye-bye.